Hmm. That's super helpful. So I'm curious then, Kenny, like, how is your view, like, maybe like similar to or different than like theistic idealism? Like, does your like idea allow for like mind independent stuff, or like how does that work? Because when I first like learned about you a little bit more, it was when I was talking with like Graham through like email, and he's talking about like theistic idealism, and he put it in like parentheses like people such as you and a couple others. I was like, oh, this Kenny Pearce guy, I should like look him up. And and then I talked to you, and obviously you say your views a little bit different. So like, how does your view like relate to theistic idealism?
Yeah, so here's the thing. So I'm a theist and I'm kind of sympathetic to idealism. I think idealism has a chance of being true. I think it should be
Mm-hmm.
taken more seriously than most people take it. But I don't think that in order to endorse my grounding view about God, you have to be an idealist. Um, but this gets into a tricky issue about the definition of idealism. So I said earlier that um, idealism is a view that the kind of fundamental bottom layer of reality is mind like.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, look, all classical theists think that God is the ultimate fundamental layer of reality, that God is somehow more fundamental or more real than the created world prior to it metaphysically. And God is mind like in some sense. Mental
Yeah.
terms are more appropriate to God than physical terms, at least. Um, and so you might think that theism, just by definition, is idealistic. That seems to me like a kind of just a bad way of using the terminology. So it's not there's not anything specific it's getting wrong. It's just not a very useful way of drawing distinctions, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we want to do is we want to distinguish theistic idealists like George Berkeley, Gottfried Leibniz, Jonathan Edwards, um, and so on. We want to be able to tell them apart from non-idealist theists like maybe Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
But Thomas Aquinas, and I mean, I think that my grounding talk is the right way of translating his view into 21st century lingo. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's contentious, but he holds something like this, right? He holds that God is more fundamental, more real, more ultimate than created things.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're trying to draw that distinction, we might say there are at least two kinds of theistic idealism. One is to say that in the created world, within the created world, the minds are prior to the physical things.
Mm-hmm.
So and this is the kind of view that certainly Berkeley and Leibniz would hold, that God creates the minds as it were first, or that creating the minds is all God has to do to make the bodies exist. As long as there are minds, in Berkeley's view, God creates the minds and gives them ideas, and the bodies exist because the minds have certain ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's one kind of theistic idealism. There's this sort of structure of fundamentality within the created world, kind of subsequent to God, and the minds might come before the bodies in that world. There's a second kind of theistic idealism that would say that the way in which the world depends on God is best described using mental terminology. And here I have in mind especially the present day philosopher Samuel Liebens, who says that he got this view from 17th century Hasidic rabbis. That this he calls it Hasidic idealism. His first paper on this has the fantastic title "God and His Imaginary Friends." So we, of course, are God's imaginary friends. And
Mm-hmm.
so on the Liebens view, Hasidic idealism, the um, the way God creates the world is something like telling a fictional story or dreaming a dream. And those are the best analogies for us to understand what's going on. And so God is kind of just thinking us up. and there
Mhm.
isn't any kind of additional like willing that's extra to the thinking or anything like that. It's just the thinking that makes the world exist. And I think Jonathan Edwards, at least on one interpretation, holds a similar view because he says, Berkeley says that that physical objects, tables and chairs and cats and things, that they're just ideas. And on one interpretation, which I don't actually agree with, I don't think this is the right way of reading Berkeley, but one way people have read him is as thinking that those objects are ideas in God's mind. Okay?
Mhm.
But there are texts where Jonathan Edwards goes a step farther and says that we also are ideas in God's mind, even human minds, and not just the
Mm.
things we perceive. And so that would be similar to the Hasidic idealism that Liebens defends. So that kind of is a second way of a second kind of theistic idealism that would say something like the created world depends on God in a mentally way.
Yeah.